Welcome to today's episode of T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor, and my guest today is Melanie Robinson. Melanie is a close personal friend that I met through the volunteer organization that we're both a part of, Explore Austin, or EA for short. In this episode, Melanie talks about what it was like to become self-sufficient at an early age when both of her parents suffered significant health problems in a short period of time, what it was like working with At Promise Youth, and the issues that affected not just the students but also the counselors, as well as losing her father 2 years ago to COVID. It is a really beautiful episode, and I hope it connects with a lot of people. As a quick disclaimer, at certain points throughout this episode, my Frenchie Monty decided to make his presence known, and you may be able to pick up some sounds of him chewing on an antler or drinking from his water bowl. As much as possible, I've tried to remove these in editing, but they still occasionally do show up. It is a lesson learned, and he is no longer invited to future episodes. And with that, please enjoy this conversation with Melanie Robinson. Melanie, welcome.
Hi.
So I want to start the episode with gratitude and say thank you for joining me today. We know each other through our mentorship program, and I realized as I was writing up my questions on the research for this episode that I've asked other people in the program, but I don't know if I've ever asked you what was the inspiration for joining Explore Austin?
Yeah. So I really love teenagers. I think they are the best set of people in the world, second only to first graders. And I, as a Black woman, don't see much, or didn't. I think it's increasing now since the pandemic, but much representation in the outdoor space for people who look like me. And I know I found a lot of like freedom and healing in outdoor activities. And so I know it feels a little better for parents, particularly Black parents, to see someone who looks like their child in programs like this. And so when I found out about it, I thought it sounded really great. And luckily they were like, yeah, you're crazy enough to drive from Dallas. I shouldn't say crazy. You're wild enough to drive from Dallas. Why don't you?
Well, that was another follow-up question I had was, given that you do live in Dallas, how is it that you came to find out about a nonprofit in Austin?
A Facebook group.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm on a group for Black women in the outdoors, and it's based in Austin. And so it was posted in the Dallas group somehow. And so I emailed Isabel and was like, hey, can you take another? And she was like, sure, apply.
Was that posted by someone who's a current mentor?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No, I think Isabel reached out to, or someone at Explore reached out to diverse groups or groups that are focused on diversity to try to find mentors. Or I don't know, that woman might have seen it somewhere, but yeah.
Okay. Were you already spending a significant amount of time in Austin, or was that at all daunting to kind of like think about that commute? Because it's a weekend a month for a several year commitment.
Yeah. No, I wasn't spending a lot of time here. Don't tell anybody, but I actually don't like Austin. I think Dallas is better.
What?
Okay. But that's changed a bit. But no, it's 6 hours in travel, and I'm my favorite person, so I really like to be alone, and I appreciate that time in the car to just like sit and to kind of get into that flow state. It keeps me off my phone and just like with my thoughts. So
do you do audiobooks or anything like that?
Sometimes, yeah. So I'll switch between like audiobooks, podcast, songs, the sound of the road, the sound of my brain.
It's underrated, like just driving in silence.
Oh, absolutely.
And just having that mental space to just let your thoughts roam.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really great.
It's like a forced meditation. Mm-hmm. Because I think if we are just, sitting on the couch or, you just wake up, the instinct is to just turn on your phone and just check out.
Yeah.
And I've been meditating for a long time, and I still struggle with my thoughts roaming. But I find like when I'm driving that it's super easy to just have that space to just kind of like work stuff through or like come up with a new idea or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like try in the morning to pray and like spend some time, and my mind is 12,000 places before I even get like the first sentence out. So, yeah.
It's good to get that out of your brain though before your day starts, so that's not your day.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you a question. Have you ever read The Artist's Way?
The Artist's Way?
Uh-huh.
No.
Oh, I think you would like it. I'll bring you a copy.
What is it about?
So it is a book that was written by a woman, and it's about, I guess, unlocking your creativity, your inner artist. Like, we stifle that as we grow up. And one of the key practices is morning pages. And so before you do anything else in the day, essentially, the idea is that you write, I believe it's 3 pages of just whatever's on your brain.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's not necessarily a to-do list, but it could be. And I think they've done like some scientific, psychological, one of those ologies research on that sort of practice and how it clears your brain to be more open and creative and receptive to thoughts throughout the day. So that's one of the key practices, and there are several in the book. But
I see. Yeah, I think also The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, I think has a very similar concept about like, and I think this relates specifically to authors, where it's like, just write every day. If you're working on a book, just write every day, and write 3 pages, and it doesn't have to be good, but just flex that muscle and get something out of your brain. Yeah. And I kind of get in and out of phases of journaling, and I find journaling very, very helpful, where like a little bit like meditation, if I sit and I do it, usually there'll be something in there that has been kind of gnawing at me, and once I give it some space and like a little bit of attention, something comes out that surprises me, and I go, oh, okay, that was the thing that's been bothering me. This was really helpful. But still, even knowing that it's productive in that way, I still a lot of times cannot bring myself to do it. I'm like, I don't want to journal, like it's not going to work. Like I don't want to just write for the sake of writing. But I've definitely seen that, but for some reason, I meditate every single day and have for close to 10 years now, but journaling for some reason is different, where it's, I don't know, like for some reason, just that act of sitting down with some paper and a pen and getting my thoughts out is somehow different and a lot more frustrating or aggravating for me. And I don't know why that is.
Do you think it's because you're self-editing?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's definitely something I do a lot in my everyday life. So very possibly it's spilling over into other areas for sure.
Yeah.
What age were you when you left Alabama?
I was 22, 23. I went to Massachusetts and worked at, well, actually that's not true. I was 21, and I studied abroad in the Dominican Republic, came back so I could graduate, graduated, and then moved to Massachusetts. So like in that 21-year-old kind of range. Yeah, and then from Massachusetts came to Dallas, and I've been there for 8 years.
How did you find Massachusetts?
I was just anywhere but Alabama. I wanted to try it. I thought I would go away for college, and every place I went, none of it felt like home in the way that the college that I eventually went to, Birmingham Southern, go Panthers. None of it felt like that. And so, I went to UNC, like I said, I went to the #1 high school in America. So there was like no shortage of like offers and money, and just no place felt like Birmingham. So I decided to stay. And when I was making the move, it was between LA or San Francisco, someplace in California doing solar energy, and working with At Promise Youth in Massachusetts. And so I was a Spanish major. I thought I wanted to go to law school to work in immigration. And then when I was in the Dominican Republic, I got the opportunity to teach baseball recruits English.
Whoa.
And I was like, whoa, teaching is really cool. And so I came back to Birmingham, and we don't have a true bilingual education program. The population at that time felt small, and I don't think we were progressive enough in our education philosophy to feel like this was something we needed. And so families were arriving without any sort of support. So I ended up helping newly arrived families from Mexico kind of acclimate. So I had kids that were like afraid of water fountains because they grew up in the campo, you know, like they were out there. And just like helping them get the things that they needed to be successful in this country and in the school system. And so I started doing that my last little bit of college and really enjoyed it. So I ended up moving to Massachusetts and working at a school for At Promise youth.
Yeah, so that was something that I really wanted to dig into today because I think that that's super interesting. So was that something that you were drawn to before this, or you just kind of like it kind of just came up and you found yourself in it? Was it something you actively pursued?
What?
Working with at-risk youth.
Oh, actually, no. I think I went there more so. I love a challenge. And
You're friends with me, so that tracks. So.
Are we friends? I like don't know what to call you sometimes. I'm like, okay, this person that I know named David. Anyway, I read the description of this place, right? And they're like, you're gonna live in a house. I'm again all about community, so I like lived communally with my coworkers. It was a pretty hippie experiment.
Yeah.
And in this sort of small town that's plagued by all of the ails, it's about 90% Dominican, or it was, and I had just come back from there, and so I really missed that culture and community. And so it was really all of these other reasons, and I read an article and it described it as the armpit of America, Lawrence, Massachusetts. And I was like, no place is the armpit. I hate it when people talk about places that people live in that way. And so I was like, I'm gonna go. And so I got a job somehow and hopped on a plane and then left. And it was through that process of meeting the students and seeing the challenges and the way that, I know we're talking about trauma, right? The way that trauma showed up for them. And so it was such a spectrum. And in that short little time, my oldest student was about 6 months younger than me at the time. So when I say At Promise, they are over age, judicially involved, and or parenting usually. So like what we would call like a second chance school or something generally.
Can you break down what all those things mean?
Yeah. So At Promise is just a choice instead of saying at risk, meaning that it's likely that they wouldn't graduate, right? And then judicially involved mean that they have a criminal record and are either currently in some sort of court custody or court order. Parenting, we had a daycare on site for teen parents. So some of our students had children together. Some of them had children with people who were no longer in school. And then over age, meaning that you have to graduate, I think, in Massachusetts by the time you're 20. It's either 21 or 22, I guess. And so they have been kicked out of the traditional school system, so Lawrence Public Schools, LPS, and we're just kind of in the world. And so we had a lot of intensive support. So I was on the attendance transformation team. So I was making home visits. If one of our students, our scholars, didn't show up to school, I go like knock on their door and be like, hey, what you doing? And sort of doing that kind of work. But we also had a student support team, which was a place that students could go because a lot of them had trouble with like self-regulation. So controlling their tempers, managing their feelings, they had outbursts, and so this was a place that they could go cool down and like with safe and trusted adults and then go back to class without repercussion. And so it was a cool model of all of these interventions that we give teachers, right? I've been a teacher. I don't know if you knew that.
I don't think I did, no.
Yeah. So that we give teachers, but that they're unable often to fulfill in a general gen ed setting. And so it was a really cool and wild experiment. I'm still really great friends with my coworkers that I lived with. And so when we talk, we're like, wow, we thought all of this felt intense and wild and kind of free reign. And then we've been in the general public school system, and it is quite magical what they managed to create in that space.
So was it like a school itself, or was this an additional resource to the school that they were already in?
It was a school itself.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's part of a charter network.
And what kind of issues did you see? Was there any particular trend or theme that presented with the kids?
A lot of outbursts. I had students on both ends of the spectrum, right? Like, I'm a 5-time grandparent now, because they're my children, so they've had children. Just explaining that for people who know. I know I look great. But, wow, you didn't have to laugh. It wasn't that funny.
It was to me.
Yeah, okay, whatever. Anyway, I had a lot of children who would have just kind of pretty violent outbursts at, what felt like their autonomy was being infringed upon. So sometimes, and we can talk about this later, but the politics of uniform policing, I'm not necessarily about. Like, if someone shows up to school and they haven't been to school today, in a while, I don't care if their shirt is tucked in. But some people did, and that was just, like, this is a way, I see that as a way that I can exercise control, me being the student in this scenario, and then for someone to take that away from me. So I saw a lot of, control issues, but I won't even say issues, especially when everything else is out of whack. But trauma wasn't always manifesting in these negative ways, and I don't think we talk about that enough, how trauma can manifest in things that society praises, right?
Absolutely.
So one of my best students, Gigi, love her, shout out to Gigi, she had been through some really traumatic things in her past, and she was always ready for learning, always showed up prepared, was top of her class, super eager, very sweet, really helpful. And all of these were validation seeking behaviors. And also, I think she derived a lot of self-worth from that. And then we had children who were more quiet, they went with the flow, but internally we're facing a lot of demons, right? And so the reason once I left Massachusetts and eventually stayed in education was because when I left, one of my students who transitioning at the end of the year in transition, died by suicide. Oh. And I think about the stories and the moments when I talk to my kids when they're like, they don't get to a second chance place without something happening to them where they stopped believing in themselves. And that typically happens early. Yeah. And so a lot of them could point back to in 3rd grade, this happened to me, or when I was 6, this happened, and it's so my passion became how can we sort of mitigate or provide positive experiences to some of those ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, to help kind of keep them on track and on trend, because they were super talented, super smart, and that you don't have to produce something to be worthy in society, but they just didn't always have the space to be who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have any sort of training? And I don't mean just you, but the people who were in this community. Were you guys selected for that background, or were you given training around this stuff, or was it just kind of make it up as you go?
It was honestly a bit of make it up as you go.
Yeah.
Pretty ad hoc, which I think is not unusual in the education system. There might have been 10 of us. Most of us recently graduated. And so I think what they were trying to leverage there was the near peer model, right? So get someone close to your age who's modeling a different life, and can hopefully move you along through this process towards graduation. And then we did have counselors on staff. But we were really trying a lot of things that I see now in popular culture. We had a dean of, I don't know if his title was discipline, but I'll never forget, we did like a restorative circle just because we had a pretty big incident in the school. And one of the things that my kids always said, which like culturally being from the South got under my skin, was that they use the N-word to refer to each other, just like casually. And so these are Afro Latinx like students, and some of them rested more heavily on the Afro than others in their defense. And so one day we were talking, and I'll answer your question directly, but this just made me think about it. One day we were having one of these circles, and we're going around, and this was the first one, so we were just practicing. And I understood the beauty in the space in that moment, because one of the students had used that word, and I was like, just please don't do that. Which, language policing, I get it. And one of the other students was like, Miss, you, we kind of just kept going. And she was like, Miss, you mad froggy today. And I was like, I am mad froggy today. Thank you so much for calling that out for me. Because I think it's good for students, for children to see adults have feelings. And I don't know that education always creates the space for that. And so that's something that like we received training on, but weren't necessarily prepared for that result of it or that incident. And then later when I moved to Dallas, I went to school, got my master's degree with a focus in special education, and wanted to get my doctorate in behavior. Decided against that eventually. But I am quite interested in both the like autism spectrum and also just the ways that trauma manifest in these behaviors. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask about the restorative circle. I'm not familiar with that. Can you describe that process a little bit?
Yeah. So imagine a large fight breaks out. In this case, I think we might have had several fights in a day. So there's a restorative circle, and then there's kind of a community restorative circle. So the restorative circle is actually working on the relationship of anybody who was impacted by that incident. So it could be if you and I got into a verbal altercation.
I can't imagine what that would look like.
Really, I can. Anyway, if you and I got into a verbal altercation and let's say we worked on the same team. So like I don't know why they would allow us to still work there, but our boss is there, our coworkers are there. A restorative circle would bring all of us together, and everyone describes the impact that the incident had on them, right? And then there's a moderator or someone to help sort of guide through the process. And so it isn't just like a come together and apologize, which I think we do a lot when, especially with students. It's a mirror, essentially. Like, my actions had this impact on others, and or like, here's also something I could have done, but there's no advice giving actually in that space. It's just truth speaking.
It is a little bit like an intervention?
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. It is a type of intervention. It falls into that strategy.
Gotcha.
Bucket.
Okay. I'm curious, was it difficult to not absorb that trauma, like, from being around it?
Yeah. Yes.
And I guess a follow-up question that would be, was there any resources available for you and the other counselors in this program to kind of work through that or process that in any way?
No, there weren't. I can't remember. I don't remember. This is how often these things happen. We had some incident. I don't remember if it was a student that had been killed or was like incarcerated, and it was like a big thing that happened over the weekend. And I remember some of us just needing some time and it not being available. Yeah. They was like, no, you got to come to work. You got to do this. And that's that's the churn of education too. Like, it doesn't stop. Your kids are going to show up and they're going to need you. And these are young adults, but they're going to show up and they're going to need you. So no, the best things we had were each other and other people. But I don't know that I necessarily felt like I absorbed that trauma, but I did become very invested in their success. You know, like, it was like, if getting you to graduate and like reach this milestone because you are so smart, Christian, like, I'm talking specifically to a student now, you are so smart, which I don't know, there's an argument about whether you should tell people that they're smart. Anyway, if like a skateboard is what you want, a skateboard is what you will get. But like, you know, even that isn't enough. And so it's like, there just felt like there wasn't enough time to actually dive into that trauma, right? Like, so my student that ended up dying by suicide, like, I'd flagged him before, and he was receiving true professional psychiatric help. But our school counselor kind of wrote it off in a way that I didn't like. And so we were all doing the best we could with what we had. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it. And so sometimes I ended up absorbing those sort of interactions, but day to day, you were able to shake it off. Or maybe I was living in an emergency situation in my head, and it was like, one day this will be over. So yeah.
Was there a lot of burnout?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a school, I think it had a pretty high level of churn. So we were called Urban Education Fellows. So it was like through the AmeriCorps program, right? But we ended up supporting classrooms with like licensed teachers, because those teachers were in Teach for America. No offense to Teach for America. But, you know, they have a 2-year commitment, and some of them stay, and then some of them are like, I need something just a little calmer.
Yeah.
And, you know, you had a really young-ish, in the education world, principal. And so everybody, for all of the good that came from people being young and relatively near peers, there was also sometimes like a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge, a lack of that. But we had some older folks as well who kind of filled in that gap. I forgot what question you asked, honestly.
The burnout.
Yeah. So if I went back there today, and this was 8 years ago, so I mean, not many people keep a job for 8 years, but if I went back today, there might be 2 people there.
Yeah.
So,
you were roughly like mid-20s when you were doing this?
Yeah.
And all your peers would have been about the same age?
Yeah.
I mean, if you had to gauge, like, what would you think the level of emotional insight or emotional resiliency was, like, as a baseline for that group at the time? Like, it sounds like that was a very difficult task that was being put in front of you guys as a group. Mm-hmm. And there was also very little support in terms of mental health resources available to you guys. Like, it seems like that would be incredibly taxing.
Yeah. I think we all brought different resources to the relationship, right? So there were 3 or 4 Spanish speakers. There were 2 Black people, 1 person who had been a college counselor. We had East Coast, South, like West Coast representation. You know, we had all of those things. And so combined, we presented a pretty well-rounded package in terms of just the emotional, or the different experiences we had, resulting in some emotional resources, like some resources in our toolkit, essentially. And so we leveraged each other for those things. In a way, we identified our strengths, right? So it's like, if I need to talk to this child and I think they need to hear like some tough news, well, I'm going to call Alicia, right? And then if we need to process something, and I'm not overly emotional, so I'm not like a person to deal with emotions in that way. If like what you want is sympathy. If what you want is advice, I can give you that. If just what you want is like someone to cry and feel that with you, usually that's not me.
Yeah.
So I'm a fairly practical person, for better or for worse. But like, if we're going to do that, we're going to call Shell Pat. And so we all brought those to the relationship with our students and with each other. And not everyone was like 22, 23. There were a couple of people who were like closer to 30 or 30 and above. Not like that makes you old or anything. But yeah, we had, I think Sam Bixler used to be a counselor of some sort. So he brought some of those skills to the table.
Do you think there might have been a trend of trauma within the counselors themselves also that maybe drew them to that work?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you find that to be kind of a truth in general with that space?
Yeah. Yeah. I find that true in a lot of these sort of like bleeding heart professions or things that are deemed bleeding heart, right? Like, I mean, even with Explore, like we all have a reason for being here. And at least part of that is usually like some form of trauma or some traumatic event or experience or adverse event, if we don't want to call it trauma, that pushes us to do this work. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that has definitely been true in my experience with Explore. Like even putting that out, the offer out to the group chat, I've had a couple of people reach out to me privately and be like, hey, like, maybe I might be interested in recording an episode. Like, I might have something to that might be on brand for the podcast. And, again, kind of like people's kind of like proclivity to keep trauma at arm's length, but not realizing that it is very common amongst their peers. Like it especially, in self-selecting groups like Explore or in the kind of professions that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe it's hard, right? To talk about. And another thing is that generally, in some way, trauma is generational, and it's hard to be the generation to talk about the thing, because chances are, like, past generations felt it or currently still experiencing it, and to be the one to talk about this thing, to identify it. I know that's true for me, right?
And me.
Yeah. To be that person is ostracizing, especially, I think, and this is true in my case, if that trauma results in something that you can be proud of, right? So I think, like, one of my many traumas is, so growing up, I've already told you, my parents were older when they had me, and so my mother started going blind when I was 5.
Oh.
And my dad had a massive aneurysm and a stroke when I was 8, and I was the person that found him and ultimately, like, saved his life.
Wow.
And so I did not have a stable home. Like, by all intents and purposes, during that year, I was homeless. Like, we had a home. My, like, parents are moderately wealthy, middle class. I won't say wealthy. My mother would cut me down for that. She'd be like, speak for yourself. Anyway, so we had this space. It was just a space that I couldn't access because my mom was with my dad, and so I was bouncing around, sleeping everywhere. Like, people, family members, friends were, like, coming to help them with me because I was so young. And in that time, I had to grow up. And because I witnessed the stress and the experience of my parents in trying to figure out this new world and new life where all of these things are true for them, I also learned to suppress my own feelings.
Yeah.
And so, it became, and the thing you get praised for is the thing you repeat, right? So, you're so brave. Oh, you're so well behaved. Oh, you're so quiet. Oh, you're so smart. And so that became where I found my worth. And when I was processing some of this, and as I started processing it, I think my mom has gotten to a place where we can talk about it. But she would push back on that because I think that was like a really painful part of her parenting career as well.
Yeah.
Like I remember one day she was going to leave and go back to the hospital, and I like wasn't ready, and I like kept trying to express that, but she was like, I have to go. And so I remember forcing myself to fall asleep so she couldn't leave, right? And so I remember that, and I think that feels very painful to her, and those sort of memories around that time, that she like for a while would not talk about it. But it kind of manifested in the way that like I don't do team sports because I don't want to let anybody else down. I'm fine playing on my own. So, you know, no, pickleball, you need two people. Never mind. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we played pickleball and I was like, oh no, I don't want David to be upset with how bad I am. Yeah. And so I was talking to my mom and she was like, your grandmother was the same way. And I'm like, oh, okay. So how did this show up for you as a child? You know, because like I got it from somewhere.
Yeah. And was she open to that idea?
To ask that question, to answer that question?
Yeah.
Not really. She's just like, you know, I did it. I did blah, blah, blah. But, you know, she played tennis. She swam. She played volleyball, was a team sport, my mother. So I guess that was it, you know, in a way. But, yeah, I kind of see, now that I'm older, I can see the patterns and the things that I struggle with that I view as a result of some sort of trauma. I can understand now kind of where that source started.
What kind of things did you end up gravitating towards?
In terms of activities or?
Yeah.
Anything I could do alone.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is also just the fear that you lose the people you love leave, right?
Yeah.
So like I loved my parents, and my dad was in the hospital for like a year, didn't see him. Then he came home and he was a completely different person because of like the physical makeup of his brain was different. And then my mom became a different person as like the carer for him. And so like my life was never the same anymore after 8, but I have very fond memories of before 8.
Yeah.
And so that time for me became like a space of imagination. And so I started writing, I started like making up stories. I was like, I think I published my first poem that year. Like I found other ways. I like was really into, and this is going to sound horrible when I say it, but I was like really into the Holocaust because like the idea of having to like hide in a small space was interesting to me. Right.
With so much chaos going on around you.
Yeah, with so much chaos going on. So that's what I gravitated towards in terms of activities, but I also stopped doing a lot of things, right? So like I started violin, but like when I wasn't immediately good at it, and I like came home and my parents had bought me some things that were completely unrelated to the violin, but I was like, if this is about violin, you can take it back. I'm not going back because like it took me a while to learn that learning is a process because I'd always been so good at everything.
Yeah.
Right. So I was like reading a 3rd grade book in 1st grade. Like I'd always been so good, like head of the class, top of whatever, that anything that didn't come naturally, I just wouldn't do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I imagine also at the time that even though you were at an age where you still needed a lot of care and a lot of attention, that that was probably relegated to second priority with both of your parents' health problems. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that a lot of those activities where you just got to be with yourself and like you were the sole focus probably felt really nice and like almost indulgent.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I never thought about it that way. Huh. That's an interesting bend on it. Yeah.
I had a very similar but different version of that, mm-hmm. which was like I started to realize roughly around that same age that basically like there was no adults in the room, and that if I was going to get myself out of a bad situation, like I was going to have to crawl out of this hole myself. Mm-hmm. So kind of in that same way, like my reading massively accelerated, and like I think that was maybe like one of my first addictions / like compulsive patterns was reading, and then computers, where like I could, we didn't even have any games at the time. I just like figured out how to do everything on a computer when I was like 8 or 9, and it allowed me to kind of like just be in my room where it was quiet, it was safe, I could just spend hours just pouring myself into something, and that just felt really nice and really natural. And that carried all the way through to easily my early 20s. And I'm also curious, like, what you saw as like kind of some of the ways that it more broadly affected you, like in a more negative way.
Yeah. I still have a really hard time relying on other people, but I so deeply believe in the value of community. And so, my mantra is just like, I'll do it myself so no one else has to let me down. Yeah. So I think that's true. I also have a tendency to test relationships because I don't want to put my all into someone who is, like either going to choose to leave or leave. I don't know if you know this, but I was engaged.
No, I didn't know that.
About 5 years ago. And we had, he loved me so deeply and so well, and I was just like not about it. And he ended up dying. And so I think like that was something that was really hard, but was also a turning point. And I feel like I'm deflecting your question, so I'm going to go back to it. That's been really hard, is relying on other people. It's gotten a lot easier, but it was really hard to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And I have like a pretty direct communication style. So of realizing the way that people take what I am putting out and then adjusting course to it is just something that I'm consistently aware of. I'll meet somebody who's like a friend of a friend, and they'll be like, she asked me if you liked her at the end of it, and I was like, oh, I thought she was fine. And, yeah, and I like don't overly heap on praise because I feel like I got so much of it that it was a detriment.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm like, you did this thing. I just try to state factual stuff. So yeah, I think those are just a few. Who feels the safest to you? Like, do you have a safe person?
In EA?
No.
I have some guy friends where like, so what I've realized recently is love and support are like the most important things in my life right now. And I think like for a very long time, what love was not clear to me. And, like especially in romantic relationships, I mixed up sexual intimacy and emotional intimacy a lot. And it was actually easier for me to have emotional intimacy with my friends than it was with my partners. And what I have found in Austin is like a group, like a very close-knit group of guy friends where we're all incredibly vulnerable with each other. We are incredibly supportive. Like the love is unconditional, but then also like we challenge each other, and there is accountability. And it just feels very right. And like in terms of like looking for love and support, I couldn't ask for more from a group of guys. And then on the other side to that, like, my therapist, she's, phenomenal, like an absolute rock star. And, like, just the way she is able to hold space and to, tease out what I'm feeling and like connect my intellectual to my somatic is just really mind-blowing. Like, she is just phenomenal at what she does.
Good. I'm glad you have, well, I don't know if I need to be closer. I'm glad you have those people.
You were fine where you were.
Okay.
Do you feel like you have that in your life?
No. Yeah, I think I can pretty safely say that. I have sort of a way to compartmentalize. I think people generally find, because people are just waiting to be asked, right? Like, they are willing to talk about themselves. They just want to be asked. And I think that's a deflection tool for me. And so I find myself in a lot of unbalanced relationships where people feel really close to me. And I'm like, it's fine. And so I take that in, I'll talk to my mom and be like, well, I went through therapy with these people today. And like, I've got 2 more people next week that need to talk to me about like these things. And so people will like dump on me and I can process it and I can hear it pretty objectively and help support them through whatever it is that they're doing, right? So like, I met with one half of a broken relationship last week. I'm going to meet with the other half of a broken relationship next week. Like, one part of this really big thing, like one part of dealing with like an uncertain pregnancy, like, like all of these big life moments that I think it's like, this is too intimate for family, but feels appropriate for a friend. But I don't know that I would count all of those people as friends.
Yeah.
And so when things happen, there are very few people that I would like go to immediately, right? Like, when my dad died, I told my roommate because I had to, and because we lived together, and I was like, I'm going to be gone for an uncertain amount of time. They told me he had 3 to 7 days, and the next day I was on a plane, right?
Yeah.
And so I flew home to Alabama, and I called one friend after the fact, and I happened to be with another when I got the call that he was dying. And so 2 people knew, and they're 2 people who I count as like pretty close to me, but I don't know that I necessarily feel fully safe with either of them. So I tend to process my own thoughts a lot. And so like talking about flow states and like driving, I like love cooking. And so while I'm in the kitchen, like chopping something, I will like replay things in my head all the time. Now, call it what you want, but I swear there are different versions of me that can handle different problems. And so I can give myself some pretty decent advice. It's just whether I take it or not. So that's something that I deeply want, is that like type of community and sharing. I find it hard to be that vulnerable, like sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such an overshare. I would never. But it's like, I tell people all the time, like, ask for what you need. Like, if you need someone to be there or whatever, like, do it. Like, I'm a really great friend, but I don't know that I allow people to be a really great friend to me.
Yeah. How do you get your needs met then right now?
I don't have any.
Okay.
Just kidding. I'm a Vulcan. I give a little bit to a lot of people. And hopefully it all comes together in some way that feels like it's achieved the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's it. You know, I know that there are people that I could pick up my phone and call and be like, this is how I'm feeling. And they would probably be taken aback because they'd be like, I've known you for 14 years and you've never said these words to me. But I think it goes back to what you said about recognizing that people are flawed and people aren't going to show up in what I think I need to hear all the time, right?
Yeah.
So like when my dad died, one of my friends was like, I don't think I ever saw you cry about him. And I was like, yeah, but why would I? Like, I'm not just gonna go. I don't need to mourn in the streets. This isn't Jerusalem. Like, old Jerusalem. I don't know what they do in New Jerusalem. You know, and so it's like I am like a very private person. The only time you'll ever see me cry in public are large displays of patriotism or like children with their parents, like little ones. I just think that's so sweet because it's so pure. They like don't know any other world yet.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, the world's gonna crash on you. But right now it's beautiful and that's really exciting. Yeah, and so I hold that in a lot. But I do, like, I'm able to have these sorts of conversations, like, with you. And so I can reflect on that logically, you know, in my, like, small groups at church. Like, I can have these feelings and emotions. It's just really hard. So, like, therapy is something that's really good.
Yeah.
For me. Just because it's, like, another person. And I don't want anyone else passing judgment on anybody that I care about, right? So, like, my parents are my best friends. And, like, I use that term friends loosely. I know, like, they're not really my friends, but they're my favorite people. And I also recognize that a lot of the ways I show up, again, for better or worse, are the results of them. And so I am always hesitant to let people know about some of the, like, points of conflict or tension in our relationship, because I don't want them judging, like, my parents. So, like, therapy is a safe space where I'm like, she's never gonna meet Sandra,
Right.
You know, like, she's just not. And so that's nice and easy, and it's also really nice because then I don't feel the need to defend them, right? Because even when I try to work through some of that stuff with myself, I will defend them. And it's just nice to hear somebody say, well, it sounds like you're saying that this might be the way, and just to have that kind of reflected back. And
yeah, I think that's one thing that people really struggle with, especially when it comes to, like, strong feelings towards their parents or, like, childhood stuff, is that duality of your parents were doing their best with what they had, but you can also feel sad or angry for your experience in that. And it doesn't have to be one is right or one is wrong or, like, who is to blame. Like, it can be both. Like, you can acknowledge that, like, something was sad or challenging for you, and it does not make your parents bad people.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, I've struggled with that, but then also, like, that seems to be something that is recurring in conversations that I have with people about this stuff. And, like, particularly people who are right at the start of their journey where it's like, oh, like, I had a pretty good childhood. I don't want to blame my parents for my screw ups. And, you know, just largely it's not about that, right?
Yeah. It's a mourning, like a shedding of
Absolutely
the world that you created.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're open to it, can we talk about your dad passing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you had mentioned off mic that it had been as a result of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about like how that sequence of events played out?
Yeah. So my dad speaking of veterans, was a Vietnam veteran. His name is Farnsworth, and he just loved me to no end, you know. And I might cry. Who knows? Okay. That's okay. Anyway, he was exposed to COVID by a caretaker, because since he had the aneurysm, like, you know, mobility had been difficult, and just age, he was 75, I think, at the time. And so my parents both were exposed to COVID and got COVID in October of 2020. And I drove home, you know, as soon as I found out, which actually, honestly, in the face of COVID, probably wasn't smart before a vaccine, but whatever, you do what you can. I drove home, and so my dad had already been admitted to the hospital because he was having some sort of like respiratory things. He'd also previously been dealing with some blood disorders as a result of his service in the military. So he was exposed to a chemical that kind of made him hemophilic.
Yeah.
And so he was in the hospital. I felt like he was getting the care that he needed, and my mom was at home, and they were so bonded in a way that honestly is probably unhealthy. But like I said, they dated for 15 years. They've been married for over 30 at that point. So, you know, the good part of like 45 years together, you just get used to that person. And this was the longest they'd been apart, but also Sandra, my mother, had a really difficult bout with COVID, and ended up being hospitalized, at which point I was like, all right, well, if I lose both of them, I will be orphaned in a moment. I'm an only child. Oh. And so it's like, there's nobody there to process that with you. Now, I will not be unfair to my family. Like, my mother has a sister and a brother who I am close to, and, you know, like, there are people there who will be there for you, but just like, nobody is going to mourn that parental loss in the same way that you would. Yeah. And so I was kind of gearing up for it. My mom was out of it. My dad was in the hospital, hadn't really seen either of them, or couldn't really see either of them, and they weren't with it. So it was like, honestly, like the best lead up you could get to your parent dying, I think, because it's not like, oh, they were alive and well one day. I think those are the ones that are really, really hard and kind of shocking. It was, I haven't talked to them in a week, and I've talked to her probably 3 times already today. Like, I talked to my parents a lot. Yeah. And so it was a nice sort of shift. And I think in that time, it actually allowed me to do some growing up, right? Like, because I'd always talked to them so often that I would check my decisions by them all the time. And so fast forward a little while, Farnsworth is in the hospital. I saw him. He was like kind of out of it, but chilling. And they'd finally located what was like causing his most recent episodes of like hemophilia. And it was a bleed in his intestine, I think. And they were like, we can fix it, you know, as soon as he tests negative for COVID. And so he was in this ward at the hospital. Turns out they'd kind of mismanaged his care, and he had like this like really nasty wound that wasn't discovered until he was sent home. Anyway, I love Alabama. Maybe don't trust the hospitals. But he came home. They were going to do it, and you know, you can test negative. I mean, you can test positive after you've had COVID for a while, even if it's gone. And so he was still testing positive, so they wouldn't do the surgery. And so when I say he died from COVID, he died as an effect, like a side effect, essentially. Yeah. After a secondary cause. And I got a call on like a Tuesday or Wednesday. I was like in the Popeyes drive-thru, and they were like, the doctor's on the phone, and she told me, you know, we've done all we can do. It's just basically time to say goodbye. You guys need to figure out what you want to do. And so, you know, like whether he would die in a facility, like a home, essentially, or they just weren't going to keep him in the hospital because it was peak COVID time. There were no vaccines. They were like trying to move people as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And so I came home the next day because I had this information, but nobody else did. And so I flew home, told my mom, and that was the hard part because she had COVID. She was finally starting to feel with it. She was in such a good mood because she loves me so much as well. And so I walked through the door and she's like, oh my gosh, my baby's home. What are you doing here? And she's so pumped.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I can't keep it up because I've been with this information for such a long time. And so anyway, I told her, we went to go see him, decided to bring him home, back to our home. And so readied our like basement or downstairs, for like a hospital bed for him to come home in. And when we saw him in the hospital, he was like pretty out of it and kind of listless and just, honestly, I think he probably would have died in 3 to 7 days, probably three days, had we kept him in the hospital. But we brought him home, and so it's like that was a level of comfort. And so he was bouncing off the walls. Like, fine, I have recordings. Like, I was able to get all of those memories, right? Like, I have a recording of my dad saying "Good night, I love you," and like,
that's so beautiful.
That's just something you don't get in the modern death industry. So I'm like really, really thankful for that time. But anyway, brought him home, decided to put him downstairs because my mom also was in a hospital bed on the second level of our home. There are 3. So she was on the second level of our home and just like didn't, because death has a sound and a smell and it's very visceral. And like didn't want, I know she can't process that in the same way that I can, right? Like this is something that a space that I feel very comfortable in. And it's not something that she like ever likes to talk about. So anyway, we made that decision. They got to spend a lot of time together. And as he started to go downhill, Sandra, you know, decided to not see him. And so his last day was coming up and I, you know, got to care for him, got to wipe him, got to like body, got to like control the oxygen. I administered the morphine. Like I got to do all of these like caring gestures for him. And he, that sucker, I had to go pee. I went to go pee and he died. All damn day, David.
He was just waiting for his chance, his window.
Yeah, he was like, she's gonna have to pee sometime. Yeah, and so he died, and yeah, so that sparked a whole like different kind of realm of experiences. But moving a little past that, I'm ordained, so I got to like perform his funeral.
Wow.
And it was a really great way to say goodbye to my dad.
Yeah, I mean that seems just really powerful. Like that whole process, like it seems like you were able to contribute so much to it, and then also he was also able to give you so much in that time. That I mean, that just the beauty of that, like even in its darkness, is very striking to me.
Yeah, and I think that's what, we don't have to talk about death, but I think that's what death is, right? Like we don't get to make many choices. We don't get to make any choices about how we like come into this world, who we come into this world to. But to the extent that you're planning for an old age death or just a death at any period of time, you can make decisions that give that like last gift of time to your family or to the people that you care about, and also like give you some agency. And so that's the one thing that I still struggle with, is that my mom decided that we weren't allowed to tell my dad he was dying.
Oh. So,
you know, we're like fending off hospice priests. We're like, you don't need to be here. This like white priest showed up at my house and they were like, your father's gonna be like, why is this white man in my home? he was used to other white men, but not that one. And yeah, and so, you know, it's hard because I'm like, well, I feel like we robbed him of the chance to deal with that. She's like, he puts on a brave face and he is so brave. But she's like, I know he would potentially be scared. And I'm like, are you projecting onto him? And so anyway, I honored her wishes in that, and we never told him. But I think he knew. There was a point where I was like sitting by his bed and he was still awake, and he just like was squeezing my hand.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I've never died before, but I'd like to think that you get some forewarning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me. I mean, that is an incredibly powerful story. Any closing thoughts or messages that you want to deliver to the world?
Ooh, get your dog spayed and neutered. Just kidding. This has been The Price is Right. Thanks, David, for having me and creating
Thank you.
This space. I don't know. Recycling is a hoax, but you should do it anyway. Climate change is real. Hug someone that you don't know, but with their permission. Consent is sexy. That's about it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I am really grateful for you coming today. I mean, as we had talked about before we started, like I wasn't really sure where this conversation was going to go, or kind of like what topics we were going to touch on. But I mean, I think this has been a really beautiful conversation. I think we talked about some good stuff, but also like it felt incredibly personal, incredibly vulnerable, and incredibly intimate. And I really appreciate you showing up to do that for me today. So thank you.
Yeah, David. Can't wait to hear your voice in my ears. Go to bed.
Yeah, I'm excited for this journey, and you've been a part of that.
Yeah, congrats.
Thank you. All right,
Okay.
and we can wrap there.
Yay, bye.